humility. Another quote of his, when talking about landscape architecture and ugly architecture, he said that a doctor has the opportunity to bury his mistakes, but an architect can only advise to plant vines. So he's also among very few architects in the 20th century to be credited with inventing a style, which is extremely difficult to do. He pulled this imaginary collection of building bits that he ultimately called the prairie style from his imagination. You know, he lived in a time of Victorian houses. Victorian houses, as you know, are, you know, chopped up into small little rooms, and he was looking for something much more open than that. And of course, he became a household name. So his early days, he is the son of a preacher. His father was both a minister, a musician, and artisan of sorts. Not very good at any of them, by the way. And as his family grew and the pressures grew, the father got tired of it and left, leaving Frank Lloyd Wright as the oldest of all of the children to help raise the kids. Something I don't think he really liked and ever got over. He was homeschooled like most kids at the time, and his mother had decided that he was going to become an architect, a notion that he embraced early in his childhood, to which, as Aparna quoted earlier, that he had determined to become the greatest architect that there ever was. I'm not quite sure he was the greatest architect that ever was, but he certainly is among them. So he played in his childhood with what was known as the four-wheel blocks, a picture of them here. They're more than just blocks. There was string and twine and various and odd shapes where you could construct something, hang shapes from those structures with the twine. This gave him a really strong grasp of geometric patterning, which you'll find in his carpets, his windows, his buildings. And this led also to a great appreciation of the same patterns that he found in nature. He spent a great deal of time, mostly the summers, on the Welsh family farm in Wisconsin. He did attend the University of Wisconsin, but after a short period of time, didn't really like it and left. He did get some understanding of engineering principles while he was at the University of Wisconsin, which benefited him well in his later practice. So, you know, how we figure out a person's existence on the planet and their contributions and the things that occurred in their life is you put together a timeline. This one was put together by an owner of a house. I've redacted where the house shows up on this timeline just to show you the major periods of Frank Lloyd Wright's life. And I don't really expect you to be able to read all this tiny little print. So we'll highlight a couple of sections. The first one is the prairie period. After he grows up, leaves the house, he moves to Chicago, works for Adler and Sullivan, which we'll cover in a minute. And then the first major period of his architectural career is defined as the prairie period. It is roughly 1893 to roughly 1910. The next one is kind of a question mark. There was a gap in his practice from about 1911 to the 20s. He did do some stuff, some interesting projects, but they don't really fit into a labeled category, just rather random, if you will. And then the next major period in his architectural practice is referred to as the Usonian period. This period of his practice was prompted by a client of his, Jacobs, who was trying to encourage him. And of course, this is an age-old problem for architects, and that is, how do you design and construct a house that the average person can afford to build? And so Jacobs challenged Frank Lloyd Wright to design and build a house for he and his wife for the sum of $5,000. And of course, it wasn't built for $5,000. It was built for more like $10,000. So you can see that even the challenge didn't work enough, wasn't strong enough for Wright to get it done, because his work was just so on the edge. I think the contracting world didn't quite know what to do with it. And then there was a period of time in the 30s where his work almost dried up. I think that the architectural profession and community and general consuming public figured that Frank Lloyd Wright was done. He had his time, and now he's an old guy. And we'll talk about how his career relaunches itself, was reinvented, if you will. So he leaves University of Wisconsin, moves to Chicago, gets a job with a local architectural firm, friends of the family of his uncles. His uncles convinced this architect to hire his nephew. And so he went to work for them. It didn't last there very long. And then his friend, Cecil Corwin, the picture in the middle there, convinced him to go to work for Adler and Sullivan, and got him an interview with Louis Sullivan, who's pictured in the white. And Wright quickly becomes Sullivan's favorite. Wright had a nice drawing hand. He illustrated really well, and Sullivan liked his energy. And so Wright didn't stay in the drafting room very long. He moved into an office next to Sullivan, and Sullivan used him kind of as they said in those days, his right hand. Wright takes advantage of this. He was always a person looking for opportunities, and so he took advantage of this by asking Sullivan to loan him the money to buy some property and build a house. And so this is what he did. He found 2 parcels in Oak Park next to one another. One was empty, one had a house on it. He buys both of them. He moves his mother into the house and builds himself a house on the empty lot next door, which becomes the home and studio property. Some of you may have seen it if you've traveled to Oak Park. So Adler and Sullivan were well known for designing and constructing high-rise buildings. The Wainwright building, which is pictured here, I believe is still standing, is credited as being the first skyscraper in the United States. Back in this time, we're talking about the early 1880s, 1890s, this period of time, buildings really couldn't get past about 5 stories. A lot of challenges to getting a building past the 5 or 6 story mark. One, people really didn't like climbing 5 flights of stairs with a handful of groceries or handbags or anything else. 5 flights of stairs is quite a distance. But that's not the only challenge. You've got to get the water up 5 flights and the sewage down 5 flights. And so typically and you'll see this in New York even now. Water towers are placed on the top of a building, and the water is pumped up to the tank, and then by gravity feeds all of the plumbing in the building. And then, of course, the sewage has to get out of the building as well. And that's always a challenge with the pressures in these pipes. Dropping, 5 floors creates quite amount of energy. And then the last piece of tall buildings is how to get the people up and down the building in a more efficient, effective, and pleasant way. And that's where Otis came in. Otis was among these early inventors who came up with a moving platform, nothing like today's elevator, obviously. It was just basically a platform with no sides on it. And, God help you if you got your arm outside the perimeter of that box. But Otis came up with a way to do the lift, and it's matured into the modern day elevator. So Adler and Sullivan did these commercial buildings. They did not do houses, but the people who were having these tall buildings designed and constructed wanted houses. So Sullivan would give the house projects to Frank Lloyd Wright as moonlighting projects. And he would, design these buildings. And there are 2 of them here on the bottom of the screen. And then the building that really changed everything, both for Wright and the relationship between Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, is the house on the top. This house was done in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and it doesn't look like anything that was constructed before. The only notion you get out of this house that it might have come from Adler and Sullivan is the detail on the balcony. You can see faintly the intricate pattern work on the balcony that matches a lot of the work that Sullivan was doing. That's the only thing that you see. It changed everything. It was the talk of the town. People wanted to know what was it, who did it, where did it come from? And this is what basically got Frank Lloyd Wright fired from Adler and Sullivan, and created a rift in the relationship between Wright and Sullivan that never really got repaired. And then the next project, the Winslow House of 1893, is the project that really launched Wright's career. This was, and still is to a large part, a seminal piece of architecture that did not exist before then, and not many houses have matched its simplicity of design or complexity of geometry. Basically, it looks like a 1-story building and is actually 2 stories. And this also became something that spurred the community, the press. Everybody wanted to know what was going on here. But what made Frank Lloyd Wright a household name was his constant appearance in the press. He was quoted once as saying, when someone talked to him about always being in the newspaper for bad news, he would say, well, media coverage is media coverage, good or bad. At least they're talking about you. And for him, if they were talking about you, then they would remember you. And somebody sitting around the dinner table wondering about building a house, the name that comes up is the guy who's in the news. And so that's how you get the work. So Frank Lloyd Wright was in the news because of his arrogant, flamboyant display of his mistress around town. They would be in his orange convertible driving around town like they were the king of the hill. while at the same time, his work was being published in national publications like the Ladies' Home Journal. This is how, the average person in this country found out about Frank Lloyd Wright, and that's how he became a household name. And so that launched and cemented the Prairie period. He began to crank these buildings out, just like shaking them off the end of his hand. The Prairie building starts out, has basically 3 floor plans and 1,000 variations. Starts out as a box, this plan that's in the middle. There's always a fireplace in the middle of the box, and something that he referred to as that's the heart of the house is the fireplace, always in the middle. And then it evolved into a cruciform where you stretch the edges of the box out in a cross form. And oftentimes those cross form stretches, they're not aligned on the same axis. So you can see in this drawing to the left, the upper axis is not lining up with the bottom axis. So he played around with the shape of the X or the cross in 1,000 different ways. And then the other one is a rectangle. He would just simply stretch the box out into a rectangle and would occasionally, as you see in this plan, pull a little nub out here or a little nub out there. And then vary the materials. It could be plaster, it could be stone, it could be wood, it could be a combination of both, all hugging the ground and all presenting a perspective from inside the building as well as outside the building where you don't actually see anything in the building. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So, he's humming along, for an architect of one principle, as his firm was, a busy year would be that you would be doing 7 or 8 houses. And at the height of the Prairie period, there were 12 houses going on at any one time in that studio. It was extremely busy. But he had gotten tired of it. He says in his autobiography that he had exhausted what he could do with the Prairie period, and he was fed up with it, longed for something else. So his work is no longer satisfying him. He's got a huge family. I think he had 7 kids. His mom is living next door. That presents some problems, I'm sure, with mom butting in with the family life, the wife and the kids and the whole swirl, bill collectors and mistresses and clients. And, you can just imagine this huge drama storm around him about this time. And he was just fed up. He was ready to leave. He receives an invitation from a German publisher to publish his work up to that point. And the cover of that book is the second image here next to Wright. And then it never did sell in the United States, not because it wasn't popular. It's that the copies of the book meant for the US market burned up in his house after a crazy person went a little berserk, burned his house down, burned those books down. And with one copy, Horizon Press in 1963 reproduced it and called it Buildings, Plans, and Designs. So Frank Lloyd Wright had that invitation. He said, that's my ticket out. And so in the time between late 1907 and 1908, he feverishly produced as many projects as he could because he needed the boat money and money to live on while he was in Europe for a year. And so I call it boat money house, boat money for his trip to get out of town. This is what that book looks like. It is roughly about 20 or so inches wide and 30 or so inches tall. And they're all individual plates, 100 of them illustrated with various projects of the Prairie period. So one of those Prairie period houses lands in Montecito, California, completely out of character and out of step with anything that's going on here in 1909. It was part of that wasmuth foley I just showed you. It was one of those plates, one of those projects he illustrated, and it's credited as being in Fresno. So the only reason why that is the case is because the Stuarts lived in Fresno, not that the house was located in Fresno. So this is the first and only Prairie house west of the Mississippi. It must have been very interesting to see this house under construction because it had steel beams, something that was very rare in housing at that time, to use steel. Typically you see steel in office buildings, but not houses. And there's only been one major addition to it, and that was in 1922 by George Stewart to increase the number of bedrooms. So I didn't know this house existed in Santa Barbara until I was on a field trip working for a local architect, and he sent me on a field trip to get some measurements or take some photographs of a project that we were working on, and this was in the neighborhood. And I wandered by this house and saw the front gate look like a miniature Tory gate. That was in 1984, 85. I looked through the gate and saw this bottom picture. The house was practically black and overgrown. And I thought, that's a Prairie house, but I didn't think Wright did a Prairie house on the West Coast. And boy, was I wrong. And then a number of years later, through a few owners, it turns out that in 1993, it's all spruced up and has a new life to it. It's only had 5 owners. The Stewarts, Greta Blickenstaff, some of you may have known of her. Mr. Walton, he didn't do the house any favors, by the way, so it's a good thing he only owned it less than a year. And then Jerry Peterson did the restoration of the house, and then T.C. Boyle and his wife Karen currently live in it. It's about 3 levels. There's a basement, ground level, and a top level, and very interesting spaces. So the picture on the left is outside in the garden, and the one on the right is inside in the living room. We'll come back to this image once or twice again. You'll notice here in the living room side, very tall windows in the living room and then a clear story. And notice that the space below the windows in the clear story don't seem to really match with the size of the structure for the span of the structure. Each one of these window bays is 4 feet. So that's 4, 8, so you can see how far across that is. And that just doesn't seem like that's enough structure. That's actually a steel beam traveling across there to hide the fact that it needs to be twice that if it was out of wood. All of this furniture was made by T.C. Boyle and his wife Karen, who have restored the public areas of the house as if it were 1909, and left and have redone the less public areas like the kitchens and the bathrooms to have a little more modern convenience to them. So Emily and George Stewart. George Stewart is Scottish. Emily and her family are from New York. George comes over from Scotland. George's sisters had moved to the United States, Montecito to be specific, and married prominent local families. And George was sent to the United States by his father to check up on the girls and see how they were doing. So he comes to the United States, never goes home again, and eventually meets Emily Stewart, and they marry and have 3 kids. The house down here on the bottom is the house that was the Utout family ranch, Emily's maiden name, in Fresno. It's situated upon 600 and some acres, a section of land that had been cleared in the 1880s for fruit and nut production, which led to the California raisin. Unfortunately, that house, when it became part of a country club by the same name, Sunnyside, unfortunately, the house burned down. So it isn't there anymore, but, and then Emily's father. So they wanted a place to get away from the heat of the Fresno Valley. So that's what led them to ask Frank Lloyd Wright to design them a summer house, or a way to get out of the heat. Wright didn't want to take the commission initially, put him off for quite a while until he needed that boat money. And then all of a sudden he was all over designing a house for them because he wanted the money. So originally the Stewart house was constructed on a parcel of land about 5 acres. It is at the corner, the house proper is at the corner of Hot Springs and Summit Road. Some of you may know that area. And you can turn the corner, park in front of the house, hop out of your car, walk up the couple of steps. The front fence is low enough. I think it's roughly about 3.5 feet, low enough that you could see over it and look at the house. And if you wanted to see the house, I'm sure TC doesn't mind visitors. Leave them a note in the mailbox and just say you'd like to talk to him about it. He's a very friendly guy. Because Wright was on a boat heading for Europe, he wasn't involved in the construction of the house. Normally, he would be involved in every aspect of the construction of a house, but in this case, he was not. If he were, the house would be oriented as it is in red here, situated along a north-south axis with a 30-degree off-axis orientation. That's so that the natural light and air can get around all portions of the building without having a true north-south cutoff to some of those rooms. No one from the Wright office was involved. All the staff left in his office when he left for Europe. Their only focus was to complete the drawings that were on the drawing board and then close the office. So as I said, it's 3 floors. The basement was a bonus because the house, when it got situated, is on a hill. And as the hill recedes and the house stays level, you've got what's available underneath the floor as a basement section. And that's where some of the support stuff is: laundry room, furnace, that kind of a thing. And originally, it had 4 bedrooms. You can see them on the 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms in the front and 2 bedrooms in the back, and a balcony or sleeping porch. Now, the curious thing about these balconies or sleeping porches is that there's nothing holding them up. You would expect that if you had a balcony of 6 or 8 feet here where I'm pointing with my mouse, 6 or 8 feet. I wonder if I can even draw, I think, can't I? Oh. Yeah. right there. If you had a space of 6 or 8 feet and there's nothing holding it up below it, the cantilevering rules of thumb would say that you would need twice the distance back here in a support beam to hold up what doesn't have any support. 1/3, 2/3 kind of a rule. That's not the case. There isn't anything holding this up. And so when I was trying to figure that out, I discovered that it is the weight of the roof over this section that is exerting extra weight along that line that is countering the weight created by the balcony hanging over in midair. So I know that's a little technical, but it shines a light on the brilliance of how Frank Lloyd Wright manipulated buildings, materials, spaces, and voids to create this illusion of something that when you stand there, you scratch your head and you're trying to figure out how is that standing up. He was a master at doing this. And we just get a little glimpse of it here in this house. You know, to give this a little more reference, looking at that balcony, the balcony is only supported by that one wall downstairs. It hangs over like this. There isn't anything down here holding it up. And there isn't anything in the living room holding it up either. So quite fascinating. So this fits a cruciform shape, as you can tell. The water distribution system is from a water tank that's up in the attic. Jerry Peterson, when he was working on the house, allowed me pretty much free access to the building anytime I wanted. So I climbed underneath, I climbed in the attic, I measured everything, I photographed everything, and discovered that during a remodel in 1922, the kitchen had a less than high enough ceiling. So the room above it was a few steps higher than the rest of the second floor. And when that remodel occurred and they dropped the floor in the kitchen, they also dropped the floor up here on the second floor, but left the ceiling that's now in the attic. And so, you know, these buildings kind of tell you a story if you're poking around enough. All right, so now on to another topic. I hope doesn't get. It's a little technical, so I'll try and keep it comprehensible. Let's put it that way. It's this notion of tension and release. Landscape architects, artists, graphic artists, all use some form of a tension and release. And what we mean by that is, if you've ever found yourself somewhat challenged, maybe emotionally frustrated as you're approaching a building because you don't see the front door or you don't see the way into the building, it's a little confusing. It causes you to pause. You're wondering, am I going the right direction? Is this the right place to be? Part of that is on purpose, and it's part of the tension and release design concept, where you're approaching something and you're not quite sure if you're going in the right direction or not. That's the tension. When you get to the front door, there's a little bit of a release because you say, the front door, I'm in the right place. And then you open the front door and the tension cycle begins again, or should begin again, where the space should be a little more constricted, maybe a little tight, ceiling a little low, and you don't get the wow factor immediately when you open the door. That's completely different feeling than if you're driving down the street and you see the front door of somebody's house going at 35 miles an hour. You see the front door, there is no surprise. There is no tension. in that. So in this case, you see this approach line here, approaching the front door. You don't see the front door from the street, so you're not quite sure if you're going the right direction or not, but you get there. And when you get there, this ceiling is pretty low. Most everyone on this call could reach up and touch the ceiling. It is just above the door height, so about 6'9", I would say. So most of us can reach up and touch the top of the bottom of the ceiling surface. And then when you turn the corner, and I'm going to see if I can zip back quickly. When you turn the corner, you see this. It goes bam, and that's the release to the front door tension. Frank Lloyd Wright was a master at creating these kinds of emotional responses as you navigate a building. The place that we first see this in his work was in Oak Park. This is the Roby House section here, where the person inside the building is looking out and they don't see anybody. You don't see anybody on the street, and what you see is landscaping, and the person on the street looking in doesn't see anybody inside the house. And so, you know, there's a little tension and release happening and a high level of privacy. So tension and release gives you approach, navigation, discovery, surprise, shielding, hiding. And the better the architect is at executing this, the more dynamic the house and the building are. So trying to understand a building and the changes that occur in a building, this is the drawing from Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. And an interesting thing about Wright's work, he said that his buildings were based on a grid. We all in the profession know they were based on a grid, but he never drew the grid on the paper. He never disclosed the grid to you. The building knew what the grid was. He knew what the grid was, but he didn't need to document the grid. So we know that Wright was not involved in these drawings because the grid is on the paper. And not only is the grid on the paper, just to make sure that you knew what the grid was, the grid is dimensioned, something that he would never do. And that was just something that that the people who are running his office, he just picked an architect off the street pretty much and said, "You're going to finish my work, and I'm leaving town." So to analyze the differences between what was designed and constructed and what was built, we put the original in black, and then we put the changes in red over the black, and that will show you where the house has changed from one project to the next. So it was modified in 1922. These red walls indicate 1922. It was modified in the 1940s, and then again modified in the late 50s. Very minor things happened in the 40s and the 50s. But if I were to do another drawing that illustrated the 1940s, the red and the black would go together to black, and then you would see the 1940s in red, and then the red and the black would go together, and then you would see the changes from the 1950s. And that's how we tracked changes in houses to analyze what's going on with them. So Emily Stewart had unfortunately died in the house in 1921 from TB. And a year later, George and Emily's sister married. Emily's sister's husband had died a few years before that. So the two of them marry more out of convenience because they both had kids and needed a mom and a dad to take care of the kids. And so they expanded this house for the expanded consolidated family. seeing if I can, there it goes. So Wright is tired of prairie. He leaves the country. He comes back to the country. 1911, he returns. Some of his major clients said, Frank, you got to give this marriage a good chance. You just can't kiss it goodbye. We are really imploring you to give it a go. And so for 8 or 9 months, he lived in Oak Park with his estranged wife and their kids, giving it his best chance. Well, I don't think he really gave it his best chance, to be honest with you. I think he had decided before he left for Europe what his plan was going to be, but to placate his clients, he stuck with it. Never did work out. And so he moved to the family farm in Wisconsin, taking his mistress with him. He changes the name of the farm to Taliesin, which means shining brow. And the first of 3 tragedies strike. One of his servants, a person working in the house, flipped out. I don't know what caused this person to go berserk, but they did. They grabbed a hatchet off the wood pile, chopped up a couple of people, and set the house ablaze, which is where those Wasmuth Folia books went up in smoke. This disaster was to occur again with another person in the house several years later, and burned the house down a second time. So he wound up rebuilding his house 3 times. And then he meets his third and final wife, the one pictured here, a dancer from Europe. And she was a calming and settling force in his life, and was keen to build and preserve a legacy. And so, and he didn't have a practice. I mean, he didn't have any commissions. He was just, kind of, flying in the air here. She talked him into creating a school, which they called the Taliesin Fellowship, where young folks who aspired to be like him and practice his brand of magic would pay him $2,500 a year and come live on the farm and learn from the master, which they did until just recently. The fellowship was still around. I think within the last 3 or 4 years, they finally closed it. But this reinvented Frank Lloyd Wright. Now he was off and running. He had lots of labor because they were paying him instead of he paying them. They were drawing his projects in the drafting room and plowing the fields and milking the cows. And they paid him for the privilege of doing that. Over this period of time, with the exception of the Roby House, over this period of time, some of the most iconic architecture came out of that studio. Many of these buildings, I'm sure some of you have seen. The Guggenheim Museum, 1959, 1960. The Falling Water House for the Kaufmans, said to be the most iconic residential building in the world. The Marin County Government Center, finally constructed after his death, but designed by him while he was alive, obviously. The Jacobs House, the Taliesin Living Room, and then the Johnson & Johnson Administration Building. The interesting story about the Johnson & Johnson Administration Building are these, what I call popsicle push-up sticks. It reminds you of that ice cream that you got from the ice cream man speeding down the street, where you push up the ice cream out of a cardboard tube. And these are amazing inventions. He called them lily pad columns. He had to convince the building department and planners that he could build a slender column that was barely 9 inches at its bottom and about 2 feet at the top, that it would support enough weight of, a 4 or 5 story building that would allow him to build them. And so they did a test on site. They built a full-size column out on the construction site with everybody standing around, and they piled sand and ultimately pig metal on top of that lily pad, and they just kept piling it on and piling it on and piling it on. It was only supposed to hold, I think, about 10 tons, and it wound up holding almost 100 before it finally cracked at its base. And then the building department was convinced, okay, we think you know what you're doing. A few more iconic, I'm kind of spanning the decades here. The Coonley House, a major house in 1908, part of that boat money trip. The Millard concrete block house in Los Angeles, 1923, was among 3 buildings patterned after blocks built in Los Angeles. This was another attempt of the architect's effort to be able to provide an owner a way to build their own house. So the notion here was, you got a mold to make these bricks, and there would be various shapes of these bricks, a corner brick, a full brick, a half brick, a blank brick, and then a brick with perforations in it. And you got these molds, and you could press out your own bricks, make your own building materials, and build your own house. Never quite worked out that way because it's fairly complicated work and entails steel and concrete and other things. So it never, the idea was nice in his head, but it never did work out in practicality. And then the Unity Church, which is just, a building from another planet in a neighborhood in Oak Park. The cool thing about this church, the sanctuary here is the main building being seen, is that on the inside, from where the preacher stands, no one in the building inside that church is more than about 40 feet away from the person speaking at the podium. Made it very intimate place to be. So Frank Lloyd Wright, 60 years after his dead, is still among the top selling architects in terms of material that you'll find. He's still making the news. I read a CNN article just last year about something going on, and Frank Lloyd Wright in the news again, 60 years after he's gone. There have been countless architects that follow in his footsteps. And we have his third wife to thank that there is an awesome archive of his work now completely cataloged and available through the Getty Foundation. And of course, he got a stamp. I mean, how many people get a stamp? Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of material to cover about Frank Lloyd Wright. I've just kind of scratched the surface a little bit and shared some of the stories and information that I know. But I'm available for questions if any have.
Thank you, Robert. I didn't know all the technicality that was involved. That's the first time I've heard about that, and that was fascinating. I don't know if you know, I was a structural engineer in my previous career, so that was really interesting to me. So I'm sure everybody else found it interesting as well. So, hey, you guys can ask him all the questions you have and, start there.
I don't know, you might need to